Astride a busy road in northern France, a tall column surmounted by the Star of India rises from between two weeping willows. At its base, two Indian tigers, guard the temple of the dead. This week, we're following in the footsteps of the Indian Corps at Neuve-Chapelle. We're starting our walk on the main roads between La Bassée and Esters as it comes into the area close to the village of Neuve-Chapelle in northern France. Here it meets a crossroads, now a roundabout, a crossroads marked on contemporary maps as Port Arthur or La Bombe crossroads. Just before the roundabout to the left is the imposing structure of the Indian Corps Memorial, the memorial that commemorates the Indian Army soldiers who fell in France who have no known grave. And over to our right is the village of Neuve-Chapelle itself. This battlefield is one of many in this part of northern France that could be described as the forgotten front of the Great War, that area sandwiched between Ypres in the north and Arras and the Somme to the south. And it's the subject of my next book on the First World War, to be published by Pen and Sword next year. And there'll be a chapter on this area of the battlefield around Neuve-Chapelle in that book. It's an area of the Western Front that has fascinated me perhaps since the very start of my visits to the old battlefields. Those battles of the early part of the war of 1914 and 1915 in many respects saw the passing of an old world into the new in terms of the type of warfare that was witnessed on the Western Front. It was a period when the bulk of the troops who fought in these battlefields along the forgotten front were regular soldiers, were territorials, were from the far-flung corners of the empire, and then latterly men from the new army, Kitchener's army, who'd been recruited in the first months of the conflict. It was an area of the front that saw sporadic fighting, particularly in 1915, but long years of trench warfare, the live and let live system of trench warfare, the active day-to-day aspects of trench warfare with bombardments, rifle grenades, trench mortars, sniper fire, mining activities, gas attacks, a lot of activity on the so-called static, quiet parts of the Western Front. But our focus here is going to look at the fighting around Neuve-Chapelle in both 1914 and 1915, in particular involving the men of the Indian Corps. So what was the Indian Corps? Well, the Indian Army before the Great War was drawn from a wide spectrum of men from different parts of India and from different religions. Before the war, the Indian Army had totalled around 155,000 men from what the British called martial races, particularly from northern India. It included men from the Punjab, as well as Sikhs, Jats, Dogras and Pathans. These were some of the famous regiments, really, of the Indian Army. And it had a strong military history, particularly in the 19th century, when it had been used in many of Queen Victoria's small wars across the different parts of the empire, but never in Europe. The Great War would see its entry into the European theatre of war. British Army, of course, itself had not fought a battle in Europe since 1815, since the Battle of Waterloo, and Mons marked that 99 years between those two occasions. So in 1914, the Indian Army was mobilised on the outbreak of the war, and it had been destined for Egypt to relieve British regular army units that were there on garrison duty and release those to come to fight as part of the British Expeditionary Force. But it was quickly realised as the battles of Mons and Le Cateau and then the approach of the Marne and the Aisne that the British Army would need serious reinforcements. So the Indian troops, instead of heading to Egypt, were sent to France and began to arrive at the port of Marseille in September 1914. Now, when these troops came off the ships there, being put into makeshift camps prior to them being allocated trains to be dispatched to whichever part of the front would need them, they received a huge amount of interest, fascination really, from the French. The French had a long history of using what they deemed colonial troops, but the Indian Army was new to them. So the French press descended on Marseille in the areas where the camps were to photograph and even film the Indian troops. And they appear on a lot of contemporary postcards that were published in France at that time and were amongst their best-selling postcards of the period. As these Indian troops assembled, they were brought into a formal army corps, and this is a grouping of units, in this case 2 divisions, of Indian troops, the Lahore Division and the Meerut Division, and a lot of supporting units such as Service Corps, artillery, cavalry and supply. An Indian Army division was very similar in its composition to a British one. It was about 18,000 men and comprised of 3 brigades, but the difference was they weren't all Indian troops. So in an Indian infantry brigade there were 4 battalions, but one of them was from the British Army and 3 of them were Indian Army battalions. Now this was a legacy of the Indian Mutiny of the 1850s. And thereafter the British had decided that every Indian brigade should have to stiffen it up to make sure there wouldn't be a mutiny again. Now obviously this is not my view, this was the contemporary view, that it should have this British battalion in there. And even in the time of the Great War in 1914, this was a practice that continued. So for example, if we look at the Garhwal Brigade, that was made up of the 2nd Battalion of the Leicestershire Regiment, the 1st 39th and the 2nd 39th Garhwal Rifles, and the 2nd 3rd Gurkha Rifles. So 1 British battalion and 3 Indian Army battalions. Their fighting record in 1914 was an incredible one, really, and by the end of 1914, 30% of the British Expeditionary Force was made up of Indian Army units. So that's 3 in 10 of the BEF soldiers holding the Western Front from the trenches of Ypres down into northern France near La Bassée were Indians. And by the end of the war, 1.3 million Indian soldiers had fought in every theatre of war where the British forces had taken the fight to the enemy, whether that was the Western Front, Salonika, Mesopotamia, Palestine, Gallipoli. The Indian Army was there. The Indian Corps Memorial where we begin this walk was designed by Sir Herbert Baker, who was one of the chief architects of the Imperial War Graves Commission. It was unveiled on the 7th of October 1927 in the presence of Marshal Foch, who had commanded Allied forces on the Western Front in 1918, Lord Birkenhead, who was then Secretary of State for India, and Rudyard Kipling, whose writing was so inextricably linked with India, with its people, its history, its culture and its language. The memorial commemorates 4,843 Indian Army soldiers of the 8,557 who fell on the Western Front, so that's more than half of those who died. Many of these men were men killed on the battlefield, just like soldiers of the British Army, whose bodies could not be retrieved after attacks that had failed, such as at Neuve-Chapelle or in the fighting of September 1915, and therefore sadly with the shelling and the artillery fire their bodies became part of the battlefield and their remains could not be recovered, could not be buried. But many Indian Army soldiers of this period who were killed or died and whose remains could be recovered were not buried, they were cremated. So instead, they don't have a grave, a headstone in a cemetery. Their names are commemorated on the wall here at the Neuve-Chapelle Memorial. The names that are listed on this memorial date from the battles of 1914 around Neuve-Chapelle. They date from the fighting that continued at Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, when the Indian Corps, as we'll discover, played a heavy role in that battle, and also from the attacks that took place in this sector on the 25th of September 1915, a date that we associate with the Battle of Loos. But in this area, the Indian Corps carried out a diversionary attack from Neuve-Chapelle across towards the Moulin de Pietri near Bois-Grenier and suffered extensive casualties in that attack as well. There's every Indian Army regiment and corps that was on the Western Front listed on this memorial, and there's almost every rank from the most humblest right through to battalion commanders. And among the names are 2 recipients of the Victoria Cross, including Gobar Singh Negi of the 2nd 39th Garhwalis, who was awarded a Victoria Cross posthumously for his bravery at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March of 1915. But there are Indian Army soldiers who died in other sectors of the Western Front in France listed on here, and it also includes white Indian Army officers who were on attachment to other units of the British Army. So, for example, Lieutenant Colonel D.D. Wilson of the Indian Army is listed on here. He didn't die at Neuve-Chapelle. He was killed at Gommecourt on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, commanding a battalion of the Sherwood Foresters. It's a magnificent memorial, the Indian Corps Memorial. On its walls are carved the badges of the different Indian units represented by the panels of the memorial where the men are listed. When the memorial was unveiled in 1927, a large number of Indian Army veterans still serving came to attend the ceremony. The Second World War approached, and in 1940, Indian Army troops who were part of the 2nd BEF, that British Expeditionary Force of World War II, marched past this memorial en route to Dunkirk to be evacuated. But in the decades that followed the Second World War, the number of Indian visitors to this memorial declined. But during the centenary period between 2014 and 18, there was a big focus on the often forgotten history of the Indian Army on the Western Front, and a large number of Indians came here on pilgrimages on visits to the battlefields. And this is something that has continued and I hope will grow in the years to come. When we leave the memorial and walk round to the fronts in the approach to Neuve-Chapelle village, we notice more prominently here the damage to the monument from the Second World War. I mentioned that Indian troops marched past here in 1940, along with many units of the British Army, and as the German blitzkrieg spread across this ground, they noticed this move of British troops along these old Roman roads that crisscross this part of France. Some time ago on a leisure tour, I had a veteran of the Royal Military Police who had been on traffic duty during that period and had witnessed the monument being bombed by Stuka dive bombers, as he recalled them. Now, whether they were actually Stukas or another German aircraft, we'll probably never know, but the damage to the front of this was caused during that period when bombs fell here and fragments from the explosion damaged the fronts and the facades of the monument. And rather than head off into Neuve-Chapelle village for the moment, we'll go round to the back of the memorial to see another memorial, a smaller one, to an officer of the British Army. This is a private memorial to a British officer who fell in the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle on the 10th of March 1915. And if you look at it, and I'll put some pictures on the Old Front Line website, oldfrontline.co.uk, you'll see it too was damaged in the bombing here of 1940. It once sat on the other side of the road, on the corner of the junction here, in its own little park that had railings round it. And it's one of a number of such private memorials that existed along the old Western Front battlefields in the 1920s, when families came out here before the great memorials to the missing were built to build their own monuments to their sons who had no known grave. Cyril Crichton, who it commemorates, was born in 1893 into a London Jewish family. He was educated at Marlborough and then at Exeter College, Oxford, and while training at the Inner Temple, he joined the 1st 3rd London Regiment, the Royal Fusiliers, as a second lieutenant. He was mobilised on the outbreak of war, went with his battalion to Malta and then to France, and was killed leading his men into the attack on the German lines near Port Arthur, near La Bombe Crossroads, on the 10th of March 1915. He was buried on the battlefield, but in 1919, when his family came here, there was no trace of his grave, so his father bought the ground where he thought his son had died and placed this memorial there. So at that point, he was missing, and no decision had been reached by government as to how missing soldiers like him would be, or if they would be, commemorated. So it's those circumstances that prompted families like the Crichtons to come here and fund and erect a memorial like this. But the story continues, because in 1925, during some ploughing near this part of the battlefield, his body was found, and he was then reburied in Le Touret Military Cemetery. So this was a memorial that once commemorated a soldier who was missing in action, whose body was lost in the fortunes of war and had not at that point been discovered, but only a few years later it was found and he was reburied by the then Imperial War Graves Commission in a military cemetery. But the ground, of course, had been privately purchased by the family, so the memorial survived. And the family seemed to have given money to the Imperial War Graves Commission for its maintenance, and the damage caused in the Second World War was made good, but the railings don't seem to have survived. It's possible that during the German occupation of northern France, they were taken off to be scrapped for the German war effort. I have a photograph taken in the 1970s by John Giles, the founder of the Western Front Association, that still shows the memorial on the corner of that crossroads. So sometime around then it was moved to where it is now, so it could be more carefully looked after and maintained by what is now, of course, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. But Crichton's monument is one of a large number of these memorials, private memorials to soldiers who were killed in the Great War along this British sector of the Western Front, some of them in very good condition like this one because the family had made sure that the War Graves Commission would maintain them. Others, no such provision was made, and some of them are in a truly shocking condition. And as we move beyond the centenary, I do hope that in the cases of quite a few of these, I can think of some on the Somme, that something has to be done about these before they are lost, because they are an important part of our understanding of the grief of the First World War, of how families coped with the death of missing soldiers, and how they sought to memorialise them. But we'll continue on our journey now down into Neuve-Chapelle village. Leaving the Indian Corps Memorial, we'll effectively turn right at the roundabout and walk down the road that takes us straight into the village of Neuve-Chapelle. Neuve-Chapelle was a small farming village in 1914 in this area of northern France, a fairly flat area dominated by open fields, agriculture being the main industry here, and those fields crisscrossed by ditches and drainage ditches and small streams, which all would feature one way or another in the fighting of the First World War. And that war came to this part of northern France in October of 1914, when the Germans were carrying out the so-called race to the sea, the attempt to try and push through the Allies in the northern part of France and in Flanders to break through to the French coast to try and cut off France and Britain from the outside world, seize the Channel ports and end the war in Germany's favour. And it was places famous like Ypres that stood in the way of this, but less famous, the ground between La Bassée and Armentières, where British and Indian units stood their ground during that period. Just beyond Neuve-Chapelle, the ground does rise slightly to what is described by the British as a ridge, the Albers Ridge. Now, by any standards of England, Wales, Ireland or Scotland, where we can think of incredible ridge lines across the countryside of those places, the Albers Ridge is only tens of metres above sea level, so this is more of an incline, but on a flat landscape it's enough of a bit of high ground to give you an advantage. And in 1914 in this area, it's the British that initially have that advantage, as they're holding the ground, the woods, the roads, the ditches and the small little hamlets and villages along that Albers Ridge to try and stop the Germans as they advance through this area towards the Channel coast. Now gradually the Germans push the units of the British Expeditionary Force, those old contemptibles, back over the Albers Ridge down into the ground here at Neuve-Chapelle. Beyond the village is a large area of woodland called the Bois de Billet, and between that wood and the village is a stream called the Laze Brook. The Germans capture both the wood, the stream and then the village in October 1914, and that's when British and Indian units launch a counter-attack. In that counter-attack, two Indian units in particular are involved, the 9th Bhopals and the 47th Sikhs, and these become the first Indian troops to go into action on French soil in the Great War. So this is an important moment in the history of the Indian Army in the Great War. And in this action, the infantry from the Bhopals and the Sikhs push through the German lines on the outskirts of Neuve-Chapelle. They're supported by Indian sappers and miners and other engineers from the Lahore division. They break through into the village, and the engineers, who are normally employed as specialist troops on the battlefield, also take part in the hand-to-hand fighting that ensues, and they help erect barricades in the street of Neuve-Chapelle. So as we've walked into the village, standing outside the church now, for example, we're very close to where those Indians built the barricades in 1914 to defend the positions taken by the infantry, and then the engineers, the sappers and miners, they participate in holding back the German counterattacks. However, with the general collapse of the positions in this area and then the surge of German troops, the village of Neuve-Chapelle has to eventually be abandoned and the Indian troops pulled back. But it results in the award of some of the first decorations to Indian soldiers on the battlefield in 1914. Following these actions here that autumn, both sides dig in. The Germans dig in around the village of Neuve-Chapelle, and the British and Indian Corps troops do the same on their side of the battlefield. And the trenches, the first trenches, are built. Now, due to the problems with the ground in this area of northern France, when you dig into it, it very rapidly fills up with water. The trenches here became a mixture of trenches and breastworks, so positions built up above ground level to offer some protection for the men who shelter behind them. That trench system and the infrastructure behind it was built up during that first winter of the war. But of course, for the British, this was not a defensive war. Their policy, alongside their French allies, was to evict the German invaders from mainland France. So in 1915, that year becomes, in this whole sector of the Western Front, becomes about a series of offensives to try and achieve that aim, to defeat the German army on the Western Front. And the first proper British offensive of the Great War took place here at Neuve-Chapelle on the 10th of March 1915. There had been a couple of attempts in Flanders in late 1914 to try and attack the German positions there, but they weren't really what you'd call full-scale battles, whereas Neuve-Chapelle was. The purpose of the battle as a whole was to break through the German lines around Neuve-Chapelle, retake the ground beyond, so cross the Laise Brook, advance through the Bois de Billet and get back up onto that Albers Ridge and beyond, and try and disrupt the whole lines of communication behind the German positions in this area as a result of breaking through their lines of defence. A huge amount of artillery was amassed for the bombardment, everything from 13-pounders, and there were 13-pounder light field guns in the Indian Corps, through to the more common 18-pounder field artillery, some bigger guns, 60-pounders, 6-inch, and even a 15-inch howitzer manned by men of the Royal Marine Artillery was employed as part of the bombardment here. The guns began their crescendo about 35 minutes before 0 hour, and the German positions were pummeled by these guns of all calibre, more than 300 of them. Some accounts talk of British soldiers standing on the fire step looking over the parapet, watching German machine guns and troops being blown up into the air. And the German defences in front of their trenches at this stage were not the thick belts of wire that we think of when we think of the Great War. These were what were called knife rests, which were two wooden crosses connected by a central beam and round which was wound barbed wire. They were quite flexible in terms that they could be moved around to create lanes in or out of a German position. But it also meant they weren't necessarily fixed and so were vulnerable to this amount of artillery fire. At 8:05 on the 10th of March 1915, the whistles in the frontline trenches blew. British units from the 8th Division, which was a regular army division that was made up of battalions of the British Army that were in the far-flung corners of the British Empire on the outbreak of war, had been recalled to Britain, reformed into this new infantry division, and had come across to France in November of 1914, and up until that point had yet to see action in a major battle. It had just held the line during the winter of 1914-15, and had been one of those units that had helped build up the trench system and the infrastructure of the battlefield here. And so at 0 hour, it was the battalions of that division that made their way forward into the trench system on the outskirts of Neuve-Chapelle. Despite the bombardment, quite a lot of German machine guns had survived, and some battalions fared better than others. The 2nd Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, for example, near a position called Signpost Lane, suffered tremendous casualties from the German machine gunners who had survived the bombardment. But generally the British pushed on, got through the village, reached the Laise Brook, the Laise stream, just beyond, about halfway between the edge of the village and the Bois de Billet, and it was here that these British units met up with the men from the Indian Corps, who had attacked on the right flank of Neuve-Chapelle, through the area of Port Arthur and La Bombe crossroads, across the ground on the western side of the village, and had reached the area of the Laise Brook, the so-called Smith-Dorrien line marked on the maps of the battle. Here they met up with the 8th Division, and beyond them was the Bois de Billet, and the Derodun Brigade moved up, and they made an attack on the wood. But to get there they had to cross the Laise Brook, and what we'll do now is we'll leave the church of Neuve-Chapelle, take the road almost directly opposite and walk out of the village, down past the football stadium, to a little concreted bridge across what is the modern Laise Brook. And when we look at this now, it is just a stream. You could leap across it, but it was greatly flooded by the winter and early spring rain. The Indian troops that had come up to take part in this attack had been issued with assault bridges to get them across this flooded Laise Brook. Now, this was probably the first time in the Great War that assault bridges like this made up by the engineers before the attack and issued to the infantry, small sections of bridging that could be carried by a few men and then placed over the obstacle. Probably the first time, as I say, that this was used by troops on the battlefield in the Great War, and it would be a piece of kit that would be employed in many subsequent battles at different phases of the Great War, right up to the very last battle in November 1918 with the crossing of the Sombre Canal, when very similar assault bridges were used there. The Indians got across, they moved into the edge of the Bois de Billet, and they sent fighting patrols forward to try and find out where the enemy was located. Only one battalion had made it into the wood itself, and that was the 2nd Gurkha Rifles. They began to dig in to defend the position in case the Germans counterattacked, and some of their fighting patrols went forward and captured a German prisoner from the 56th Infantry Regiment. Now, a German infantry regiment is about the equivalent of a British brigade, so it's several thousand men, and he revealed the fact that the entire regiment was coming in their direction. On their left, another Gurkha battalion had failed to get into the wood and capture its objectives there, so as the evening drew on and it was clear that a sizable German force was coming in their direction, a decision was made on the ground that the Gurkhas would have to pull back because a single battalion wouldn't stand a chance against a German force of that size. So in the fog and confusion of war, with connection between the units on the battlefield poor at that stage and men worn out by a heavy day's fighting, that chance of pushing on beyond Neuve-Chapelle through the Bois de Billet to the Albers Ridge beyond slipped away. And as both British and Indian units dug in along the Leesbrook, that would pretty much signal the high tide mark of the British advance in this area for almost all 4 years of the Great War, because this ground would be retaken in the German offensive of 1918 and not properly cleared until the summer of that year, when the final Allied offensive swept through this area of northern France. From where we're standing on the Leesbrook now, we'll continue down this road, and it'll meet another road coming across us from left to right. Ahead of us there's a minor road going through the wood itself, through the Bois de Billet, and we'll take a walk through there just to give us a sense of what the wood and how big the wood is. There's very little trace of the war as you walk through here, even in the spring and winter. The ground is undulating because this sat just behind the German lines for the next 3 years after the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle and was obviously heavily bombarded by British troops. So while the signs of shell holes are there, there's very little trace of the actual trenches. On the far side of the wood, the road comes out of the far side of the wood and you can turn right. But along that edge of the wood, there are a number of concrete bunkers. And back in the 80s, I came here with some friends of mine, and we found a very, very sizable German bunker here, which is now completely engulfed in trees and I think is pretty much inaccessible. And we went in there, and it was a later style of bunker, probably from about 1916 or 17. It had external firing positions for a rifle section and machine gunners, and then you could go inside the bunker where the main shelter was, and it was pretty much unchanged since the war. It still had "Gott mit uns," God is with us, painted on the inside of the bunker, and I hope that is still preserved within it today. So we'll retrace our steps and go back through the wood, back to that road just before the Leesbrook. We'll turn right and go over to the far side of the village of Neuve-Chapelle. There's a secondary road that crosses the Leesbrook again, and this was on the left flank of the British advance here in March of 1915. We'll cross over that little bridge over the Leesbrook, and it brings us up into the outskirts of the modern village of Neuve-Chapelle. There's a turning off to our right, the Rue de Mauquissarts, and we'll take that, and it'll take us to the hamlet of Mauquissart, which was separate from Neuve-Chapelle at the time of the First World War, and was also a high tide mark of the British attack in this area in 1915, and became our front line for much of the rest of the war. There's a little track that goes off to the left just before a wooded area, and inside that wooded area there are mine craters from the First World War. The so-called Mauquissart Salience was an area of intensive mining activity from 1915 onwards, and we'll follow that track about halfway across the fields. Neuve-Chapelle will now be ahead of us to our left. We can see the church spire. To our right is looking up towards Armentières, the top end of the forgotten front, as it were. And here, as I say, were the frontline trenches following the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in 1915. And in November of 1915, the 2nd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards were holding this part of the battlefield. and a new officer arrived as a replacement on attachment to the battalion. But it just wasn't any old officer. It was the Right Honourable Winston Spencer Churchill. Churchill had been Lord of the Admiralty on the outbreak of the Great War, and he had planned the disastrous Gallipoli campaign of 1915, which by that autumn it was clear that this was going to be a failure, and Churchill had resigned and had sought a command on the battlefield. He was now on attachment to the Grenadier Guards to get some insight into what trench warfare was about, and he would spend a little bit of time here with them before he was given a command of an infantry battalion, the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, and served with them in Flanders, not far away at Plugstert or Plug Street in the southern sector of the Ypres salient. So when Churchill was here, he must have looked through one of the wooden box periscopes out into no man's land and seen the smashed landscape, the bodies of men who had fallen in the 1915 fighting here, both British and German. Little did he know at that time that this front would barely change for much of the next 3 years. And the 2nd Grenadier Guards that he was a part of would be one of many hundreds of battalions that would pass through here. Battalions that would come here not to fight, but to experience static warfare on this vast scale, just holding the line, standing fast in the face of the enemy, the German army, and looking out just like Churchill across this battlefield. And today we stand here too, under the gaze of those 2 tigers on the Neuve-Chapelle Memorial, who look out across this ground and remember those men who came from half a world away, from India, to serve and give their all here on the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.